Welcome everyone to this week's to the May e-dialogues that we're hosting at Energy Dialogues. We are delighted to have you all here today. While I'm doing a few introductory remarks, if you would like to, in the spirit of collaboration, if you'd like to put in your name and where you are joining us today from, company, region, just to say hello, that would be great. And a few words from me. So we have a very interesting and, of course, very timely topic today with how to bridge the gap between aspirations and reality when it comes to future energy supplies. Very important topic with what's going on today geopolitically and with the different energy realities in different parts of the world. I'm delighted to be joined today by a great group of experts and thought leaders and decision makers in the energy sector. We have John Davies from Davies Public Affairs, Scott Tinker with UT Austin, and Octavio Simos with Tellurian. And before I'm handing it over, I'd like to just quickly thank our sponsor for today's e-dialogues, Davies Public Affairs. And I'd also like, for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, Energy Dialogues, very briefly just to say that what we do is we bring people together for dialogue. We like to say that we bring people together who don't necessarily agree, but are willing to engage in respectful conversation and debate. And we bring people together who don't necessarily meet, but should, all in the spirit, again, of collaboration. So maybe to be a little more specific in what we do, we host a number of virtual dialogues such as today's. We have a lot of university collaborations and events and other meetings, a membership, and all of this with the idea to inspire solutions, inspire productive dialogues, and build collaborations with the idea to solve tomorrow's and today's toughest challenges for the world and for energy access, really. And I know we have some people who have a lot to say about this in just a couple of minutes. So with that, really, I'm welcoming you again all, and next I'd like to welcome our prestigious panel for the day. We're really delighted to have you here. And today's session will be moderated by Octavio Simos, President and CEO of Tellurian Inc. And really, it's more of a conversation amongst three very accomplished energy thought leaders. So with that, I leave it to the panel, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you, Monica, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel here with Scott and John. So let's get things started right away. We have the main topic of today is how to bridge the gap between aspiration or ambition and reality. So as setting the ground or the framework for that, we know that in the last 200 years, the relative contribution of all energy sources has changed. Sometimes it's gone down, sometimes it's gone up. But in absolute terms, no energy source, whether it's biomass, coal, oil, gas, wind, solar, has ever gone down in total utilization. So it keeps going up as a result of demographics and energy demand. So when we have this ambition, sometimes that it's portrayed as replacing, or sometimes called as transition from and to, of taking a lot of these energies, and for the first time in history, energy contributions from these sources going down in absolute terms. It means we're replacing in addition to adding, which creates all kinds of issues on supply chain problems, whether it's production or processing, regional issues of availability and economic, and the burdens that it puts on the supply chains in some of these countries that aspire to more energy are the ones providing all of the products to the countries that are more developed. So with that as the framework, I'd like to start with Scott. And what are your thoughts on this gap of ambition versus reality, sort of like in macro terms? And what are the main issues and some of the thoughts about how to go forward? Oh, sorry, I cannot hear Scott.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that. I said it's good to be here with you, Ottavio and John. Always fun to have these conversations, and I think if you think about ambitions, not everybody has the same ambitions always, and that's part of the challenge. We're not that unified in those necessarily, and realities always vary as well. So it's not an easy platform as you start to think about that. I think if we can think about some ambitions that I think most would agree to, it's one of them is lifting the world from poverty to prosperity, and that is something that's challenging, but starting to get some dialogue. And if we don't do that, all these other things sort of take a back seat. So this reality of global growth and global health is important, flourishing, if you will. And if you frame it in that term, the other thing that has to flourish is our environment. And certainly CO2 and methane emissions in our climate are a very big piece of that. They're not the only piece. The land, the air, and the water matter as well. So how do you bridge the gap? You start to perhaps have dialogues that frame something that people can agree on to begin with. And then you can get into that space. What are the forms of energy that can bridge us between where we are today and tomorrow? Continue to protect different big parts of the environment and lifting the world from energy poverty. There are good options there. They're going to vary around the world, but it's a little different dialogue than perhaps just a binary dialogue about climate change only or certain kinds of energy only. And I find when I see conflict, it's usually around what's the frame to begin with. So I'll just kind of leave it there as we start.
John?
I think that's a great opening, Scott. As always, thoughtful, looking at from the big picture. It's an honor to be on here with the two of you, both people that we look to for thought, leadership in the industry, and what's going on. Scott, as I look at the bigger picture is from poverty to prosperity. It goes through energy, and it's gone through energy for us. And as a nation, as a society, when we lived in log cabins with a fireplace that we cooked on and we used for light and for heat, our average age of longevity was under 40, and our life was pretty tough, and infant mortality was incredibly high. We drank horribly dirty water, and so the whole idea of getting back to a better time and a simpler time is getting back to a time of a long drop toilet, which in the middle of the winter couldn't have been all that enjoyable. And so the transition that we constantly hear about, and as someone who's been like you have, Scott, to Africa a great amount of time over the past couple decades. I mean, I just see the transition that needs to happen in the world is twofold. One is it needs to become cleaner, that we can make oil and gas, fossil fuels cleaner and cleaner, that we have the ability, and we need to transition to getting that to the third world to provide them with the energy needs to bring them out of poverty, where they're looking for water or looking for things that energy could bring them, and they're not educated, they don't have a job, they can't take care of their families because of energy poverty.
Mm-hmm. John, it's interesting. The word clean is one that is challenging. What does that mean? And probably everybody on here might have some different image when they think clean. My guess would be think about emissions, atmospheric emissions, greenhouse gas emissions when they hear clean. And that's certainly a part of it. So in that sense, we're talking about an emission transition rather than an energy transition. As Ottavio laid out so well, we're really not leaving much behind globally. Now, regionally, geopolitically, we've seen things decrease. But if we could think about the clean emissions piece as an emission transition, that targets our action somewhere. But then with clean, I always include the land, the air, and the water, because they are so vital to environmental health, and they all are interactive, they're very interconnected. So that's something that many in a room are okay with, and some often are not. They think it's distracting or gets us off the main goal of climate. I think, again, though, if you just do emissions, if you just do CO2, you could end up hurting other things, maybe the use of the land, depending on the energy and how much it takes, et cetera. We could dive into those topics, but mining and landfill and disposal and all sorts of stuff. So we have to frame it in a non-binary way.
Right.
We really do have to include some of these big components. It's solvable, but it's not simple.
Yeah, there's nothing simple about it.
I think, Scott, you started speaking about the topic of dialogue and how do we go about having a discussion that makes sense. Before we leave the framework of kind of the reality of energy, one of the things that struck me in a recent debate that I was this notion that we seem to adopt a narrative of one size fits all. Wind and solar are great. Everything else is terrible. Maybe hydrogen. We should, whenever we have it, we should put in it. But the fact is, regionally, this is not going to work, and we all know that. The minute we put more gas in Europe that was supposed to go to Asia, Asia burns more coal. So there are limitations regional on the availability of energy that we really need to start developing regional approach to achieving what we all agree. We want to have cleaner energy. We want to have accessible energy. We want it to be affordable. We want to have some security by nations, so we're not dependent on third parties to do what you need to do. We need to throw in some conservation. But every region in the world is going to have a mix. And then on top of that, what I started to think, I'd like to get your thoughts on, is the fact that if the United States, Canada, Western Europe decides to go all in on wind and solar, yeah, we can probably afford it. I mean, there's a price to pay, but we can probably afford it. But the supply chain for those components come from regions that they'd be using a lot more energy that is dirtier in order to provide everything we need in the Western world to achieve that goal. So the burden on the supply chain in the undeveloped country, I think, was Rob West that listed, the second largest producer of CO2 emissions in the world is the production of goods in the developing countries to supply the developed countries with the goods they don't want to fabricate and produce and can't in their own. So how do we start with a framework that really deals with what's possible? Because we will need every source of energy. We don't have enough energy from all sources to meet the demands. We need all of them. And if we start vilifying coal or vilifying oil or vilifying gas, we even forget the fact that we still need coal for certain things that are not to burn and produce electricity. We still need oil and gas for a number of things like plastics. What are your thoughts on how do we create the frame or, as an engineer, the control volume that's big enough to capture all these issues that we need to address and then develop the best pathway going forward?
Go ahead, Scott. I have some thoughts from the political and communication side, but
go ahead, John.
Well, I think from my point of view is that what you just laid out in a short few minutes is it's volumes of books worth of thoughts and ideas of everything we do in energy has a shadow, and renewable energy EVs all have a shadow. There's this incredible excitement about having electric vehicles and about having battery storage and solar and wind. But just like oil, gas, coal, there's a shadow to it. There's an impact, and the impacts aren't all equal. Everything's complex, and where we get things from. If we're going to be all wind, where are we getting the copper from? What is it, 2 to 5 tons worth of copper that goes into wind turbines? Where are the copper mines? Well, they're not in the U.S. because we keep turning down copper mines in the U.S. And there's not a lot of copper mines in Europe. There's some in Canada, but the Canadian copper mines are being defeated also. So we're going to get it from the third world, where they're going to get the impacts and they're not going to get the energy. So it's a lot more complex than just saying we're going to become all renewable. We're going to get rid of oil, gas, and coal. There's a need for education in our society, and from my research of the public in the U.S., and we're working on one in Canada, which I can't wait to see the numbers, is that the public is actually more aware of this complexity and support for the different industries in different ways than our decision makers are. And the public is very favorable to natural gas around our nation, strongly. And even in California, a recent poll that we did in the oil and gas industry with oil, it's above 50%. And should we get rid of oil production in California? It's like 48% said no, not at all. No, don't do it. And so that's California. That's on the falling edge of get rid of everything. So I think the idea this is more complicated than the decision makers think about it because they think in headlines, but the general public gets it more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Tavio, you asked about a framework. I think that has to start with some language, just some terms, right? We've talked about two already: transition, which really isn't from one to another. We keep adding things. Clean, which is emissions, but more than that. A couple other important terms. I mean, you mentioned one that essentially you're talking about fungibility or fungible. Can one thing interchange with another very easily and rapidly? Not in energy terms. It's hard. So yeah, uh, density, energy density is another really important term. We have to understand to frame this out. Whether you're talking about energy per unit area or volume or weight, there are some forms of energy that just are denser than others and hundreds of times denser. Nuclear, uranium and thorium, natural gas, hydrogen, liquid, carbon, oil, carbon and hydrogen, and even coal with just carbon are just a lot denser than the light or the heat from the sun and the motion of wind or water and or waves and tides. So understanding something like that is fundamental, and we can't ignore that. We have to say, all right, if it's denser, what does that mean? Well, it means it takes less stuff to take it from its current form to the way we use it. And if it's less dense, it takes a lot more stuff to collect it and get it into the dense forms we need. So logically, and actually, the sun and the wind and the waves and tides take a lot of stuff to collect them. They're very low density and get them at in the volumes and in the forms that we need. That stuff all comes from the earth. And then it gets used and then it gets dumped back in the earth. And so another big term is renewable. We use it often, we all do, but the reality is there's no renewable energy. There's the sun and the wind are, but not the solar panels and the wind turbines and the batteries to back them up. There's nothing renewable about it. It comes from the earth, a lot of it, and it gets manufactured and then dumped back in the earth. So do oil and gas and coal. They're not renewable either. So if we could get over these terms that make us feel good, like there's hope, right? There's renewable energy and it's clean and it will transition to it quickly and it's cheap. Let's just get on with it. None of those things are actually true. So we have to do more than, nobody owns the truth. We do have to seek it, and we have to base it in data and look at what's happening as we move forward. That's not to depress anybody. Again, I'll say it again. It's not simple, but it's solvable once we begin to address these things and have the language that we agree on. So that to me is a big part of the framework. It's just some language that we can agree on.
Well, I'll pick up on the language piece because language is the foundation of dialogue. And obviously the dialogue has not been a dialogue. It's been two people on monologues in the same room. It's my characterization of it. And so how do we, and I think it's got some challenges, obviously. So I can share, and Scott, you were there, but we just went through an experience of 2 days of intense conversations among 100 people that were very obviously educated on issues of energy across the whole spectrum of ideas and thought. And we had 9 students that, after being exposed, 9 young people being exposed to those 2 days, changed their answer to questions about energy and how to go forward because they were able to see and be part of a process that made a difference. So I'm going to start with John here since that's his specialty here. I mean, a dialogue sometimes gets a mix of facts versus emotion, right? You can try to be very rational if somebody is more emotionally connected. It's very difficult. It's got to be more listening than preaching, and we see a lot of that. People not listening to what the issues are because and accept the fact that I think Scott, you said at the beginning, there's a number of common objectives that we all agree upon for different reasons, but we agree on. And how do we then translate that into credibility and trust that allows us to have a dialogue and a language that we all use in order to be able to have a dialogue as opposed to two monologues. John, what do you think?
Well, you hit it on the head, Octavio. We listen first, and we live in a time where no one listens. I mean, go look at Twitter, go look at any social media, go to a community meeting that you're talking about, any type of energy project, and the place goes crazy. I mean, half the people are like, we don't want to lose farmland for solar. We can't have this. We can't have that. You got to go and listen to the people. You got to listen to them and let them talk. And because when we're to approach someone with a conversation, we have to come in there with a common language and a common understanding. We don't have to agree with them, but we can understand where they stand. And then we can have a moment to approach them more from the point of view of, unfortunately, from a story rather than just facts. Because what happens with facts is they bounce off people. They go through their factual evaluating side of their brain, and if they've already decided they don't like it, they're not going to listen to you. But if you go into the creative, the right side of the brain, the right brain, and you tell stories, and those stories are factual, but it's a story, you start to have a conversation, and you start to hear what's happening. And I contend that in our society today, that the leaders are less open to hearing the stories and hearing the information on either side. We need the leaders who favor all sorts of energy production to really understand this too, that they need to listen and they need to share the stories. But those who are like anti and think we need to transition away from oil and gas without a conversation, they need to be open-minded, have a conversation. So who do they listen to? They listen to their constituents. So we need to work through constituents to change public policy. We can't just do it through the leaders. And to do it through the constituents, we need to motivate them, and then we can educate them. Because once they're motivated, they'll be educated, and then we need to get them to start talking to their local decision makers, their local member of Congress, their local U.S. senator. And that includes business leaders who don't really track what's happening in energy. And I think you both have run into that people that are serious business leaders don't understand the industry at all, where the energy comes from, how it works. I mean, our interviews with high-level thought leaders all over the country, we ask them where the electricity comes from. And you guys know what the answer is, right? The two most common answers, from the plug in the wall and the wires on the street. And then I think we have some plan. So there's a great need in America. We have a very low energy IQ in this nation right now.
Scott?
Yeah, we do. That's, when I formed the 501c3 Switch Energy Alliance, gosh, a long time ago, and started making films, was to address that very issue, is just to bring us there. We all don't have the luxury of travel. Take us to the facilities and the sites and to the people and listen to their stories and try to put that together, get into the high schools and the universities and Congress and other places. That's working. Others are doing that too, but you got to make sure you do that in a very open and with high integrity, that you look at the pros and cons and objective civil critical thinking. Quite often films like that can be activate activists or certainly looking to tell a certain perspective. Proudly, universities are pretty proud of their active positions on things now.
Right.
Unfortunately, that doesn't always represent then multiple sides of a story. The government has roles to play. They can certainly hurt progress, and they can enable some of it too through incentives, but in some ways, maybe just step back and let markets do their thing imperfectly, but they will do it reasonably well, because when they fail, it's big disruptive outcomes, and you see that today in Europe. The government policies have failed. They believed that there was cheaper, less impactful, cleaner energy available, and that they could go there quickly. They tried, and it has failed. The price has gone way up. They're going to dirtier energies now, coal and other things, to try to get secure energy, reliable and available and affordable energy. And it's costing a lot more money. As a result of that, the energy security in Europe is going down tremendously. They relied on Russia and others. And so this is something that you can see coming. but maybe experience is the best teacher. There are still voices saying, let's double and triple down on unreliable energy. And by that, I mean solar and wind and things that aren't there all the time. It's unreliable. That's not judgment. That's just the reality of night and wind. So, but you can make them reliable with other partners. So I'll tell you where I head with this in my head is we got to stop this war between energies. You know, this is the energy and that one's not, and this is good and that's bad, and this is clean and dirty and blah blah. We recognize it's a portfolio of options, and portfolios are usually pretty good things. You're gonna mix those together in ways that create the affordability and reliability and security that we need. Enough of the warring, and let's start to collaborate and agree. And a little bit of the challenge comes with the investment community. They pick their investments and they carry messaging too, and get pretty conflicted sometimes when they're promoting their best and latest and greatest. And you can just go look at positions of some of the big PEs, private equity groups, a few years ago and where they are today. You know, the transition is rapid. And at the end of the day, we just need to recognize they're there to make money, period. And they're going to promote their stuff, period. So are companies. And that's okay. But let's not try to conflate then the environmental politics with that, or the justice and the other kinds of things. Let's stay out of that world a little bit, big investors, and stay in what you do well, and companies what you do well, but let others kind of work through how that plays together. And I know that's Pollyanna and asking for something that probably will never play out like that, but I think we got to be a little more candid in what our conflicts are and our positions in these various conversations as we come into them. Where are you? Where's your money being made? What are your politics, etc., as we begin to discuss these portfolios?
And those are excellent points. We're having some to keep this as interactive as possible, and I want to pick up on a point you made, Scott, which is related to infrastructure. But we got a couple of the comments that came here on the chat box here. So one, it's a question on, interesting, goes back to the dialogue issue. What's your perspective on the state of developed countries pressuring developing ones to leapfrog to new energy and not develop their own ONG potential? It's a little bit of some of my friends in Africa saying the rest of the world is worried about the end of the world. I'm worried about the end of the month. So I don't think we have an answer for this question, but we clearly addresses the dialogue issue of not listening. What do you guys think?
Well, leapfrogs happen when something better comes along. That's when things change. Some better technology. Whale oil got replaced by kerosene for a reason. The phone I used to hang out and talk to my girlfriend, who's now my wife, 40 years ago, had a long wire on it into a single closet, and I would hide from my siblings. And there's a reason that's gone, is because this thing now is better. It's detached. It does all sorts of other things. Leapfrogging technologies happen when something better comes along. And I think there's still this confusion that solar and wind are better than oil and gas. In fact, they predate them. Oil and gas are newer than solar and wind. Solar and wind have been around for a millennia, growing the vegetables and food we put in our vehicles, oxen and horses, and helping to create wind, etc. So the motion of water, they've been around a long time. The confusion comes when I think the judgment terms, those are better, so we can leapfrog Africa to those and pressure Africa. In fact, what Africa needs, with 1.2 billion people headed toward 2 billion people soon, is dense energy. They need something dense, affordable, reliable, and secure to power all of those people. And I'm not talking about a light bulb dangling from a ceiling. That isn't electrified. That's a light bulb dangling from a ceiling. Electrified is what's sitting right now, what we're doing, and behind me, and the excessive use, it could go down, by the way. But it's the access to real energy and changing your life energy. So Africa needs dense energy for that. They're not going to leapfrog beyond coal and natural gas and oil, which are the densest forms, and hopefully nuclear. But they could certainly have less dense but lower emissions forms come in partnership there. The sun and the wind and geothermal in the African Rift and hydrogen potentially and offshore, some of the tides and waves in places where that's better. Those are all there, and that could be part of that portfolio. But we're not going to leapfrog past dense. We're going towards dense.
And I think the key word in that question was pressuring. I think the idea here is that because we think we should be leapfrogged and go back to wind and sun and go back to, maybe we'll get the oxen back out, Scott, and have them walking around. Well, horses are better; they're easier to control, right? And but it's the idea that we're pressuring continent nations to go to something that isn't workable. It's something we're not doing, but we're going to pressure them to leapfrog back to that little cabin and live a life that's not as productive. And we need to give them, instead of pressuring that, we should pressure them to do what we've done, but do it the cleanest way possible. We can't be clean, but we can be cleaner, and we can be better at doing what we do. And we have that technology. When you start there, that's what we do. And so, Scott, lifting up the phone, as you know, in Africa, there's not a lot of landlines around most places in Africa because everyone has a cell phone. That's a leapfrog that made sense.
Yeah, it's better. It's better technology.
Right.
So that's a change.
Yeah. And solar and wind in the middle of nowhere is not better technology. And in places where we go that we've done water projects, the little solar roll that runs the little bit of a pump on the solar project isn't going to make enough energy for the whole village. It might pump the water for them.
Well, I have another question on chat, but I want to switch for a topic, and I'll address that question in a minute. And the topic is infrastructure. Regardless of whether you think your favorite form of energy is a solution or the one you like to see having a bigger component in the portfolio, all of these things require infrastructure. And with infrastructure comes supply chain issues, but first and foremost comes acceptability. You need financing and regulatory certainty. You talked about investment firms. That's a big issue when it comes to infrastructure. What infrastructure are private equity firms and others get behind to do it? More importantly, how do we get people to accept infrastructure? I mean, a lot of the very strong proponents of wind oppose wind when it's offshore in front of their family compound near the ocean, or in not to mention any names, or to put it across mountains in Maui because it disturbs the beauty of the mountains of Hawaii. So how do we get people, because everybody says, well, even, somebody mentioned, was either in our prep for the call, cities like Aspen, who are obviously on the very edge of support for wind and solar. Guess what? They vetoed a large solar project because they didn't want it in one of the valleys, and that would disturb the view. So how do we we keep getting into this conflict of, well, I want all those things, but not near me. We want the EV cars, but most of the product extracted from the earth in mining is somewhere in parts of the world that are unstable. And then it goes to China, where 95% of the lithium and other materials, cobalt, gets processed. So regardless of where it's extracted, where does it get processed? And you mentioned copper, John. The average time to have a copper mine approved for exploration from the day we find the reservoir right now stands at 16 years. So these targets of 7-8 years goes back to our beginning of ambition versus reality. But when it comes to infrastructure, and I know, John, you've done a lot of work in your firm when there's a proposed infrastructure project. How do you work with the communities to accept infrastructure? And Scott, you've seen the realities of not accepting infrastructure and people going to forms that are not very efficient. How do we talked about dialogue, we talked about framework. What else do we need to do to make infrastructure, forget what kind it is, just infrastructure in general, possible?
So I'm an all of the above guy. So, we people talk about all of the above. So we do wind projects, solar projects. We have almost a dozen solar projects going on right now. and pipelines, natural gas utility work, LNG terminal work. And at the end of the day, the battle's the same with the public. The public has been driven to a point of fear of looking at something coming at them. And there's three fears that we need to overcome. The first fear is the fear of the unknown. They don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I'll never forget reading the interviews that we do with people in a community where there's going to be an LNG terminal and the pipeline was going to go through a community. And they wanted to know, when they heard what LNG was the cold liquid going to be going through their neighborhood? Would it hurt the crops in their backyard? I mean, this information is sort of crazy. And so you have to listen to what people are thinking. And then you got to go share it with them. You got to tell your story, and you got to get out there and tell them what it is. And they come around when they hear it, and they want the opportunity to know what's going to be. So their fear of the unknown, and then they have a fear of change. And today, there's no greater time that people are afraid of change. There's been so much change in the last few years. They're really afraid of anything changing what's going on. So you have to deal with the fear of change, because the idea that we get to tell them is it's going to change. You get to decide how it's going to change, what type of change is coming your way. And then the third fear that drives people a great deal is the fear of being insignificant in the process. And we just completed some research on a solar farm in the panhandle of Florida, where one was defeated. And what it was defeated on was really clearly a fear of being significant or insignificant. Someone once said, it's a fear of coming and going and no one knowing. So if you're a leader in the community, or you're part of some group and you weren't asked for your opinion, you weren't contacted at some point, and then you automatically are, I don't like this because I'm not important, or they didn't ask me. And there's a lot of that in our society now at the higher levels of community. So reaching out, telling the story, and letting people know has a lot to do with it. And so, you would think that solar and wind would learn from oil and gas, but they got to tell their story. And they're supposed to be wearing the white hat. They're supposed to be the good guys. They are equally as reticent until they get in trouble to tell their story. And once they get out there, they get with it. And everything changes. If you can make the first impression, you win.
Yeah, I'll tell you referred to this thing just a week ago, the San Jacinto project. It was Chatham House rule, which no attribution, but I spent the last year with a few other folks putting that together. And we intentionally included and invited leaders across different sectors, academia and industry, policymakers and regulators and investment community heavily, trying to understand what that looked like. And one of the participants, when asked what's needed most, he said, infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. You remember that. And then we had some conversations about what that meant. It takes a lot. I think John did a wonderful job of describing public acceptance of it. On the other hand, there's some advantages to communism. You just build whatever infrastructure you want. You move 1 million people to build Three Gorges Dam and start putting up nuclear reactors and whatever. It can be done. Now, not most people in free societies wouldn't like that happening without some voice and input into it. So that's when you come to this concept of reality, which you started off with. The reality, the education is a natural gas Christmas tree or little wellhead sitting there, more or less destructive than 10 wind turbines, big wind turbines, over 20 years, and they would produce about the same amount of energy. Okay. What hurts the environment more, if that's your bigger concern, the land environment, or if you don't want to look at solar panels in Aspen, what are you willing to do to get your energy? Where do you think that comes from? I have a classic photo I took in Aspen of the LPG tank or the propane tank under one of these outdoor heaters in a restaurant, and you zoom in and you see there's a big no global warming sticker right on a propane tank, and you think, gosh, maybe we don't know much. Back to the energy IQ. So it becomes a conversation of education and understanding that we all are big consumers in the modern world, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. What are the best forms to minimize environmental impact, but also make it secure and reliable to us? That takes work. It just takes work, and I think we're all passionate about doing that work. We wouldn't be on this call with you right now. That's part of the work, is having these honest conversations with integrity and the pros and cons of each thing. They all have cons and they all have pros. The TED Talk I just came out less than a week ago, I gave a few months ago, it just came out. It's got 6,000 or 7,000 views now in a week. And it's called Energy and the Environment, the Dual Challenge. And 17 minutes trying to just lay out some of these pros and cons of these issues. And remarkable feedback on all these different platforms. Some are kind of snarky, but most are phenomenally appreciative and positive on thanks for laying that out. I didn't know some of that. So I think we've gotten a little worried about offending people with reality, conversations that are real, recognizing we don't know everything, but here's what we do know. We got to get away from that fear of offending people and begin to have real dialogues. Elsewise, we end up going down some roads that we look back on later and say, how did we get here? We knew this would happen, but we did it anyway.
So true.
Well, speaking of reality, we got a couple of questions here. One I'll address immediately because it's a question around the current administration committed to the Europeans to send an additional 10 to 15 million tons, 10 million tons of LNG in this year. Well, I can announce that again, not to offend anyone with reality, but every single liquefaction plant in the United States is operating to its absolute greatest capacity, well above nameplate. So we don't have anything else to put out, and the next new LNG is not going to come in until 2025. So these are when commitments are made in a vacuum that mean nothing and just create disappointment. The next question was around, can we leverage our response with our allies to the crisis in Ukraine to forge a more practical and bipartisan policy on energy security and climate? We wish for that. We hope so. I have not seen great progress. All that in one more, because it goes against this notion of dialogue. To create this response would require pragmatic approaches and dialogue, which doesn't seem to be in the menu these days. But the next one is, how can industry work with academia to take back the scientific method approach on energy and climate topics and marginalize the rhetoric that is a bit hysterical. Difficult concepts on how we create bipartisan policy. Somebody once told me the best energy policy the U.S. Congress can do is have none and let things work its way, because you may artificially create a problem. But your thoughts on those two topics that our listeners and viewers put on the chat box.
Well, I think the academic one is actually ironic, because I think the issue of academia in energy is we know what happens in most universities, albeit Scott's program is a big outlier. But just reading my three children all went to good universities, went to great public high school or private high schools in California, and reading the textbooks on the environment, they are like crazy biased towards not having anything with fossil fuels or any really fair information. And it's a little crazy, because academia has really pushed us into this position without having a full discussion as we once did about many issues. And we just don't have that discussion in the universities, colleges, or even high school. And then I think what we're finding with some of our clients and work that we're doing with getting out there with digital media, the response with people watching the EU and with us not playing off it, but playing into it and embracing what's happening. It's a lesson that people in the US are seeing, and that they're seeing that the struggle of getting the geopolitical struggle with Russia supplying the gas for Europe, that we need to be independent. And numbers on that and polling for our clients around the country is just really rising. Well, yes, we need to be independent. We need to develop our own energy. We need to be able to do that well, and that we need to keep going. And so California, we talk about the small amount of oil and gas development that's here. The rest of it has to come in by tanker, as there's no oil that comes in by pipeline here. so either tanker or rail car, and that's not really popular. And once people see that, they even California want more production. So I think the EU issue has woken up a whole group of people in the US, and we're finding that we can have that conversation and really get into it. And the other thing that we're finding right now, for the first time in a long time, is talking about the material production out of oil and gas. And that 6,000 plus materials and products are made out of oil and gas that are so essential for our society and for our economy. And people are coming around to that, and like, I have no idea. Chewing gum, dentures, lipstick, eyeglasses, guitar strings, are you crazy? That comes from the oil and gas. So I mean, there's a huge void of awareness that we can speak into, and people get excited about it.
Scott?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, I think Sweden said they're going to join NATO, which is interesting. And the challenge with energy independence is most countries can't be. They simply don't have the right mix and portfolio of energy that larger nations like Russia, 11 time zones, China is pretty large, but kind of limited in oil and gas. The US is blessed with lots of different resources. Places like Norway can, because they have great hydro, but I think the big point, and John's making it too, is not everything in the world can run on just an electron. We need molecules. And molecules come from lots of places, but the molecules that come from hydrocarbons are used in so many different ways. And then the coal molecule, the carbon molecule in coal, you need a lot of heat to make things like steel and cement. Electricity won't do it. We're talking about heat that requires burning of things to get it up to that heat level to make these things that go into the rest of our buildings. So energy and molecules are really important. Electricity and molecules are really important. And again, that's an education thing. There's so many biases, though. I probably can't share a slide. If I would show you a slide, but I just made this. I got it and made it. It shows the employee donations to midterm candidates by party in the U.S. And there's a couple dozen companies, starting at Netflix, Twitter, Airbnb, Apple, Stripe, Lyft, on down, PayPal, Tesla, Microsoft, Amazon, all the way to the bottom at Oracle, Intel. And the employee donations to midterm candidates by party, at Netflix, it's 99.6% to Democrats and 0.4% to Republicans, 0.4. And if you go on down there to Oracle, the whopper at the bottom, it's 66% Democratic and 33% to Republicans. And why do I share this? It's not that there's a good or bad here. It's that there's so much inherent bias in everything that we read, because a lot of these are our media sources and the darlings of Wall Street now. There's so much inherent bias in the things that we can access. And it's hard to filter out that bias. I have bias, we all do. And you stream yourselves things that you like to read because you agree with them and they agree with you, and life is good. Everybody agrees with me. But really, that's not how the world works. And so I think it's critical to begin to find some objective, multiple voices in these conversations. And that's how partnerships are made. Back to the question of partnerships across, is Ukraine going to force partnerships? It's going to happen as we begin to converse and dialogue around the benefits that we have to bring to each other. It saddens me tremendously, Ottavio. I was in Kiev in 1982 after college, 40 years ago, and it's a beautiful city. What's happening there it's just soul crushing to think about where they were and what's happening now. The concept of interconnectivity is a wonderful one. Tom Friedman wrote about it, and continues to, but how do you make that happen in a real way? Everybody has to get some benefit. We have to all find the benefits of being connected. Otherwise, we start pulling back into our little niches, and that is destructive at the end of the day. So that's big picture stuff, but it's really important that we think about how to open up those frameworks again across the different sectors and recognize the benefits of dialogue and trade and other kinds of things that as humans need to do.
Scott, with that, I'm sorry, Octavio,
go.
I think the greatest challenge and in almost every sector of energy, but especially oil and gas in the U.S., is we do two incredible things that is not productive. One is we don't talk, we don't share our story, we don't tell anyone anything because we're afraid, and we just hide. And there's this deal that if the very people who want to ban us and end us we're afraid to speak out, that they're going to attack us for doing so. I mean, it reminds me of a former prime minister of the UK during World War II. I mean, the thought process is Neville Chamberlain he was going to hide and appease, and that didn't work out. And then the other, when they do speak, they talk about what and how rather than why. And so the great book, the great TED speech that you and I both have done some TEDs, is Simon Sinek in Start With Why, which is a great book. But the greater book that follows it was by a gentleman named Johann Lear, who wrote a book, is How We Decide. And How We Decide says why works. It says why works, is what it really says, and how our brain works. And so when we talk about oil and gas, when we talk about energy, we talk about it from how and what. We don't talk about why. And the why is what drives the conversation. And right now, there's never been a time where people are paying more attention to what's happening with energy in our nation and around the world, where people are willing to listen. And we need to speak out from each level. As we're talking to people about any form of energy, we got to talk about why. And when we do, we find trends. And when we find trends, they change minds. And people are no longer afraid, and they start to come out, and you get dozens upon dozens of people to speak out. Maryland, a very liberal anti-oil and gas state. We've worked the number of times. One, the Cove Point LNG terminal, where it was incredibly popular. People came out in droves for it. And then second, recently on a pipeline into a county that didn't have natural gas, who needed the natural gas for an African-American college and a prison. And we're able to get through the local government and the state with a really strong why story. And the why story was about people, not about the molecules. So you talk about molecules and electrons. I talk about people with supporting molecules and electrons.
Yeah. Which people are made of molecules and electrons. So that works out very well. So, but
okay.
Just different framework. So Scott, you mentioned a lot of times in your radical middle definition that you need to get into it, you need to discuss it, but to do that you need to be willing to change your mind and take different perspectives and consider everything to get where you want to go. We have about 5 minutes left on our little podcast. It's been interesting, and knowing the three of us, we could be talking here for a while. But I want to kind of close with this notion of, and by the way, I want to highlight something. When John talks about we need to tell our story, I think that applies whether you're a wind or a solar or a natural gas or a coal or an oil company trying to do something. We
Yes.
need to educate people on all the things. There are people that are against wind and solar for stupid reasons. And there are people that are against, like they are against natural gas and oil and coal for silly reasons. So it's about the dialogue. I heard two sentences recently that I really summarize such great thought. One is, most of the things we hear today from people in media are factually correct, but factually incomplete because they spin the bias to what you want to hear. And the second one is, if you're going to create a climate argument, I heard this recently last week, if you're going to really defend and put together a climate argument that doesn't lift people out of poverty, you're going to lose. And I think those two are very powerful. As we tackle the last topic in the last couple of minutes before I take it over to Monica to close out, what do you think the narrative or the story for natural gas and for a dialogue that's pragmatic that leads us to a good path as opposed to the road to nowhere highlighted in the latest IEA report? We need a path that goes somewhere that does something. Quick thoughts from both of you. Scott, starting with you.
Yeah, Tavio, I think I think I said that in Senate testimony, completely factual but not factually complete. And you can read that. It's actually in the written testimony about over a year ago. And it just struck me that we were seeing a lot of completely factual things cherry picked, but nothing factually complete. People can read that. It's public. For natural gas, it's a versatile fuel. It has been, remains so. You can put it in vehicles. You can use it to make products. It creates heat. We can make electricity with it. It's mostly hydrogen. Very few other environmental impacts other than capturing the CO2 and doing something with it. So, and there's a lot of it. There's not as much oil. It's going to be a challenge to supply the oil the world needs. But natural gas, we still haven't gotten to hydrates and all sorts of other big sources there, including shales around the world. So let's get past this idea that natural gas is going away and instead figure out how well we can use it and what we need to do to make sure that it doesn't harm our environment.
Thanks, John.
I think the great transition with natural gas is not from natural gas to something else. It's from natural gas to a more carbon natural gas that can be cleaner, and to a natural gas that we can send to the rest of the world. If we're going to have the greatest green movement in globally in history, it will be sending natural gas around the world and replacing people burning dung and wood chips and other things. And that'll be the best global environmental movement that could ever happen.
Okay, with that, thank you both. Always a pleasure to chat with you folks. So Monica, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our three great speakers today. Of course, thank you to all of you who participated virtually. In the spirit of dialogue, I hope you all made plenty of notes and have some great things to take back to your organizations, to your peers in future conversations. And of course, feel free also to reach out to each other. That's always what we advocate and what we encourage. So with that said, today's recording will be available on this link as well as on our Energy Dialogues Collaborative, which many of you know already and are part of. It's our membership platform, and it's really where we continue to disseminate content and amplify the messages that we've heard here today, and just in general the important things that are happening in the industry. With that said, then just maybe very briefly, we have a very busy rest of the year for us. We have a few events that are still coming up. Several city series. We have the Permian Energy Dialogues in September. We have an ESG-focused city series in New York with NYU. We have our North American Gas Forum coming up end of October. All of these things you can learn more on our website. You can reach out to us, and we'll be happy to tell you more about this as well. And with that, we won't keep you any longer. Again, thank you all for participating. Thank you for to our sponsor, Davies Public Affairs, and thank you all for sharing your thoughts.